and welcome back to Farmer Stephanie's Garden of Eden. I'm Farmer Stephanie, here to share with you what I know, sow, and grow in my garden. And today I'm also here to tell you a secret. And that secret is, the trick to great gardening is to only show the plants that thrive. But we all know that that's not the true reality of gardening. We always have plants that die or get eaten by bugs or other critters in the yard. And so here today, I'm going to share with you some of my mistakes that I've made and some of my disappointments in my garden this year. Of course, there will be successes yet to come, but everybody makes mistakes. Most of my mistakes come from either trying to do something more quickly than I should have, losing patience, trying to do something earlier than it maybe should be done, or they're just a result of natural experimenting that I do, trying to find something that works well for me and my garden and my climate and the time that I have to be out in the garden. Sometimes I'm trying to grow a plant that just doesn't fit right in the climate here. Sometimes I'm trying to plant something in the ground just a week or two early to give it a jump start on the growing season. And so let's check out today some of the top mistakes and disappointments I've made and some of the experiments that I'm doing, the results of yet are which to be seen. And I also have at some point in today's video one surprise in my garden. The first mistake that I made this spring was overwatering some of my seedlings. Those newspaper pots that I was using tended to hold in moisture in the paper. They would wick moisture away from the soil and into the newspaper itself. And so I would continually be rewatering, thinking that the soil needed more water. What happens when you overwater a plant is there's no oxygen that's able to get to the roots because all of that airspace is now taken up by water in that waterlogged soil. And those roots don't thrive in oxygen-deprived soil, and unfortunately I lost some of my seedlings. The seedlings that I lost were my Kajari melon seedlings. So I was a little bit upset because I was so excited about picking out those seeds in this past January. But I think I have a fix. I think I was able to get out here and direct plant some seeds early enough that I do have a couple little seedlings right here coming up that I plan to grow up this trellis. So I did lose the month and a half head start that I was hoping to have by starting those seeds inside, but we're hoping that we'll be able to recover from that mistake and grow my Kajari melon seeds still by having some planted directly in the ground. The second mistake that I made was putting some of my plants outside to harden off for longer than they could handle out in the direct sun and wind. It happened to be a brighter day out than I expected it to be, and I kind of forgot about them out on the porch. And so unfortunately they experienced severe sunburn and most of them died. For the most part, what I lost were red noodle beans. Red noodle beans are a long bean. They look like a noodle, just like the name entails. And so I was really excited about them. They're one of my favorite things to grow, just because they are so fun and unusual. A couple of the plants did not die from that sunburn, and I thought I could salvage them. I planted them here, but I planted this red noodle bean plant probably about a month ago in the ground, and it hasn't done anything. It hasn't gained any height, it hasn't put out any new leaves, and it looks like it's even starting to get eaten by bugs on the leaves itself. And so what I did to salvage this problem, or to solve this mistake, is I again just direct seeded some seed into the ground. Now these I only got the seed out about a couple days ago, 2 or 3 days ago, because I finally just gave up on these plants that I had planted actually in the ground. And so hopefully that's still enough time in the season to get some plant growth and harvest some beans. The red noodle beans are an Asian type of a bean, and so they do have a longer growing season. They like it to be a little bit warmer than the standard green bean. And so that's something that we're just gonna have to wait and see and find out. It's an experiment, sort of just like everything else. So we'll see if that solves that mistake of putting those plants out too soon and losing some of those plants to the sun. The third big mistake that I made this spring was forgetting about my rule of waiting until the beginning of June to plant my warm weather plants outside. It involves these sweet potatoes. I was so excited to plant these sweet potatoes in these pots earlier this year that I actually planted them about a week and a half before Memorial Day, right around the published last average frost date for this area. What happened was, about a week later, after I'd put them into these pots, we were forecasted to have a very cool night. It was forecasted to be about in the low 40s, 42, 43. And I thought to myself, that's not too cold, it's not freezing. I think it'll be okay. And so I didn't cover these plants or protect them at all from the cold, and they actually experienced some very significant cold damage. It actually ended up getting closer down to about 36 that night. And when I got up the next morning, all of my sweet potato plants that I'd planted in these pots, the leaves were brown, they were withered, they were wilting, did not look good at all. I thought for sure all of the plants had died. The solution or the fix to try to address that mistake is to make sure that the plants are well watered. When plants sustain cold damage, they lose a lot of water through their leaves, and so it's important to give them a lot of water to try to recover from that cold damage. Fortunately, they didn't freeze. When plants freeze, the water that's contained within those cell walls of the plants, that water expands and actually breaks the cell walls, and there is no recovering from that once the cell walls have broken. These plants, as you can see, made a full recovery. They're thriving. We'll see how the harvest turns out. I do grow my sweet potatoes in pots because the tubers actually grow underground. And I find it a lot easier to take a pot and just dump it out onto a tarp and sort through the soil and pick out my potatoes and then dump the dirt back into the pot than to actually shovel out the potatoes from the ground. I have the horrible luck that every time I put my shovel into the ground, I cut a potato in half, whether it's potatoes or sweet potatoes, which are actually part of the morning glory family, not the potato family per se. But so I grow my sweet potatoes in these pots to try to help facilitate an easier harvest. I did try this last year. I grew them in a different area of the yard that didn't get as much sun, and so this year I've moved them to the side of the garage here where they will get more sun, and we'll see if they do better in this location and I get some more potatoes. Also, I have a much better jump on the season because I did start these slips inside. I think even though the leaves themselves turned brown and some of them fell off, I think the roots were still intact to get a good enough jump start on the plant to hopefully extend that growing season for these sweet potatoes this year. In addition to those 3 big mistakes that I made this spring, I've also sustained a fair amount of disappointment. And sometimes it's in part due to a mistake on my part, and this is a classic example of that. This is the asparagus that my friend gave me to plant. She was very generous to surprise me with some asparagus plants. She knew I had always wanted some, and she was stocking up on some for her garden, and she gave me some as well. What happened was I was kind of busy at the time. I didn't really have time to plant it right then and there, and so I put it in the fridge to keep it cool, to keep it dormant. Asparagus is rooted from crowns, which are kind of like the root pieces of the asparagus. And so I kept those crowns in the fridge. I kept them moistened to keep them dormant but alive. And I ended up waiting a lot longer than I meant to put them in the ground. I ended up waiting about 3 weeks to get them planted. And that might have been just a little bit too long. I planted these in the ground about a month ago, somewhere in there, 4 to 6 weeks ago, and nothing has come up yet. And so I'm a little bit disappointed in myself that I didn't get these in the ground right away. I was very, very excited to grow this asparagus that she had given me. We will see though. She did tell me that in her experience with asparagus, I've never grown it before, she says that sometimes it doesn't come up the first year, but it will come up the next year. So I'm not going to do anything with this bed. I'm going to keep it watered, take care of it, weed it, but I'm not going to plant anything else here. That's usually my classic go-to when I've made a mistake or something dies, is just plant something else, right? If the sweet potatoes had died off, I would have planted something else in that container and moved on with my gardening. In this case, I'm not going to plant anything else here. I'm going to keep it watered, keep it weeded, and hope that next spring the asparagus does come up. And if it does, that'll be a great surprise for me. I'm really looking forward to some of this asparagus. If it doesn't come up, then we'll proceed next spring to see if I want to try some new asparagus plants or put something else in this area of the garden. Over here, you might be able to see that I have my currant cuttings. This is the edging of the yard where I want to put these currant plants all along here, as well as fill in the underneath of the currants with strawberry plants. So you can see these currant plants are much larger than they were earlier this spring. They're putting on some really good growth, And so hopefully coming up soon here, we will finish off this brick edging. We'll finish putting in a little bit of compost and amending the soil, and we'll put these currants in the ground. And then next year, they should be big enough to start producing fruit. And the white currants are just coming in right now. They're just ripening. This is the perfect time for white currants, and so I'm really looking forward. I almost have a countdown to this time next year when I'll have some currant fruit from these plants. My second big disappointment this year has been corn. I try to grow corn every year, and every year I say, this is it. This is the last year I try. I have a big problem where once the corn starts to sprout, birds will come by and pull it out to eat the kernel on the bottom. This year I tried starting corn by seed inside, but the seed was old. It was from something like 2013, and it didn't germinate. It really shouldn't have been expected to. And so I went ahead and direct planted some corn this year. I've tried replanting it. The birds will come and dig it up, and I try to replant it and they dig it up. And I finally just kind of gave up and left the plants here. You can see the remnants of my dreams of fresh sweet corn just lying here dying on the ground. It's kind of a big disappointment because I really would like to grow corn, and I just don't think I'm going to be able to. I'll probably try one more time starting seed inside next year. And if that doesn't work, I really will have to give up on growing corn. I think it might be just too difficult with some of the animal and wildlife types that we have around here. My third disappointment is right back here where we started by my Farmer Stephanie sign. The disappointment here is my peanut plants. I have grown peanut plants successfully in the past, and I had about 15 plants that I had started inside back in about March. And so I was really excited about these peanut plants. They're so fun to grow. They have really pretty yellow flowers on them. And this whole area was filled with peanut plants. I had about 15 peanut plants. And now you can see there's just dirt and a couple marigolds. The problem here this time was not birds, but squirrels. We have a lot of squirrels in this area, and squirrels love to dig where the ground has been loosened. And so what happens is, to dig the hole to plant my peanut plants, I loosen the ground and plant the peanut plant there. And they come and they think maybe another animal buried something in there and saving it for later, and they're gonna come by and sneak by and get it. And so they dig by the plants and the plants fall over. Again, I tried saving the peanut plants. I tried replanting them 2 or 3 times, but the squirrels just kept coming by and digging them all up, and I ended up losing all of my peanut plants. There's not really a whole lot I can do at this point. The plants are dead. They're all dried up and shriveled up. And so what I'm gonna do here is I'm gonna plant bush beans. Bush beans are my solution to almost every gardening problem. They're quick to germinate. The seeds are large enough that you can directly put them where you want them. So anywhere where I have a hole, per se, if a plant died or a seed didn't come up that I was expecting to, or a plant has just run its course and it's time to put in a new plant, I put in bush beans. They germinate in 5 to 7 days. They make kind of a whole plant in about a month or 6 weeks, and so they're a really good solution anywhere I have a hole in my garden that I need to fill in with a plant somewhere. So that's what I'm going to do with this area, is I'm going to plant some bush beans here. But it's not all bad news. I promised you earlier that there would be a surprise in this video, and here it is. You remember this great plant? It's centered here in the middle of this piece of fence that we have. Well, good news. This second great plant back here actually did survive. It started growing back up from the rootstock, and so it's completely separate from the previous stem, but it did start growing up from the rootstock, and if all goes well, it'll fill in nicely this summer and be really strong, and it won't even be a question of whether it will come back next spring. So I'm very excited that I actually do have 2 great plants that made it. The third one, unfortunately, never did come up from the rootstock. But this was a great surprise when I saw that this great plant had started growing again. Of course, every year I'm always experimenting, and these are things that I'm trying out with my garden that do have a higher likelihood of going wrong than maybe growing plants that I've always grown in areas where I know they will succeed. This year, mostly everything is an experiment because I haven't really gardened extensively at this house before. I moved here a few years ago and spent the last couple of years building out the garden space. But this year I do have some things that are entirely new to me. Of course, I have my new seed varieties that I'm trying that I picked out back in January, and we hope those all do well. But I also have some new gardening techniques that I'm trying. And one of those is this netting trellis. This is a trellis that, rather than being made out of wire like some of the more traditional trellises or support frames, is made out of string. That's why they call it a netting trellis. It was something that I purchased. It came in 10 feet lengths or 30 feet lengths. I bought two 10-foot lengths, but I ended up only putting one up because I am experimenting and I didn't know that I wanted to dedicate 20 feet of length to something that I didn't know if it was going to work. Some of my concerns are that it's not as sturdy as those traditional wire trellises. However, what I'm growing here is these are my cucamelons, those Mexican sour gherkins that have the real small fruit, sort of about the size of the grape. So I don't think the plants will be too terribly heavy to pull it down, but we'll wait and see. I have it propped up with two pieces of metal on either end. Those stakes are actually shelving track that are meant for installing shelving in a closet or maybe a garage. They were actually on clearance and they were the perfect height to anchor this netting in, and so they were a lot less expensive than buying a fence post or a T-bar to anchor in this trellis. I do have a couple of fence posts that are 3 foot high. In the middle, I already had those, and so I have the two shelving track anchors on the end and two T-bars in the middle. And we'll see if that's enough to hold it up once these plants kind of grow up and hopefully take over and start producing fruit. My last experiment is back here behind the garage. As you might recall, I have plans to eventually turn this into a blackberry patch. Here's my blackberry plant that's doing well. But for right now, I don't have a whole lot to fill in this space, and it will take probably 5 or 6 years to get enough blackberry plants off of this one single plant to fill in this area. And so for now, I'm actually growing a pumpkin back here. That's my pumpkin plant back there. I just put them in the ground a couple days ago. I was actually invited by a friend to join her family's pumpkin growing contest to grow a giant pumpkin. And I don't usually grow pumpkin just because it does take up a ton of space for the amount of fruit that it grows, and I don't have a lot of space here to grow. But I had kind of this space. I wasn't sure what I wanted to put back here, and so it's an experiment. We'll see how the pumpkin does back here. Pumpkins have really big leaves, and so I'm hoping that part of this might actually help me in killing off some of the weeds back here if those big pumpkin leaves shade out some of those weeds. And so it might be a 2-for-1 benefit, and it's just kind of fun to learn about growing giant pumpkins. I don't think I'll get anything really huge this year, but you never know. We'll see. My third experiment with my garden is actually back down here in the basement, where my seed starting table has now turned into a cuttings table, where I'm experimenting with taking cuttings of different types of plants. A cutting is where you attempt to grow a plant from a piece of the plant that you've snipped off or trimmed off, rather than from a seed. Sometimes this might be a reliable way to grow a plant that doesn't germinate very well from seed. It's a way to ensure that you get a perfect replica of the parent plant as well. You do know from my previous videos and even earlier today that I did take some cuttings last year of my white currant plants from my old house. That year, I really just played with a safety in numbers. I just took a ton of cuttings and hoped that a few would survive, and I ended up with 5 cuttings and now plants that did survive. This year, I'm trying to be a little bit more methodical about it. And so these cuttings, when you make them, you really, as soon as you snip that piece of the plant off of the parent plant, it's now a race against time. It's a race between the plant forming roots versus the plant rotting from the moisture that it needs to still survive and live. And so there are different factors that come into play that you can use to try to push the favor in the plant of making roots. There are 2 ways that you might root a cutting. One is in water, and one is in soil. If you root your plants in soil, there are commercial rooting hormones, which are powders that can be used to coat the wound on the plant from where you cut it from the parent plant. And that rooting powder contains either natural or synthetic compounds that will induce the undifferentiated cells in that plant stem to turn into roots rather than turning into more stem or turning into leaves. And so that's one thing you can do to push the favor towards rooting in a plant that is being rooted in soil. That is, that piece of plant is being put right into the dirt or into the soil. There's also rooting that can be done in water, where you just put that cutting right into either a vase or a jar of water and allow the roots to form in the water. The rooting powder doesn't work as well that way because the water would wash the powder off. I'm actually trying most of my plants both ways. I have some in water and some in dirt. You might notice I have this plastic bin over my plants, and that's because high humidity is going to help these cuttings. The high humidity helps prevent the plant from losing moisture out through the leaves from evaporation and drying out quicker than it can take in water from where it was cut, whether the roots have formed yet or not. And so that high humidity helps. Another thing that helps is bottom heat. And so I have my heat mat here that I do turn on periodically to warm the soil and make the soil warmer than the surrounding air. This is also partly why I'm doing this in my basement, because it's a little bit cooler. Because we do know that two things, high heat and humidity, also favor mold formation and rotting and fungus and problems, disease with our plants. So I do need to make sure these air out every now and again, and we'll see how they turn out. So I have these are some purple leaf sand cherries that I have rooted in a little container. I have 9 cuttings that I'm starting in this one container, but then I do also have over here, I have some that I'm starting in water as well. And so we'll compare. It's kind of an experiment to see. I hope I do get some that survive. I have purple leaf sand cherry. I have chokeberry or aronia. I have some lilac. I have some mint cuttings from my mint project that I've been working on. The mint is growing so well. I've actually started making cuttings from the mint. And because mint is really invasive, it really likes to send out roots and spread all over. The mint cuttings work out really well. I actually already know that from just earlier this year. I have some more currants that I'm going to see if they turn out. I have some cuttings from a tulip tree. I want to see if I can grow a tulip tree from a cutting. And so just a kind of a whole hodgepodge of things that I'm trying with my cuttings. And hopefully it'll work out. And I'll see kind of with my combination of, plants starting in water versus plants starting in the dirt with the rooting hormone, what works best. And maybe one style works better for some plants and one style works better for another. I'm just going to kind of try a little bit of everything and see what works for me. That's kind of how I approach all of my gardening. I don't always do things the textbook way. I'm looking to do things that work for me and sort of my time that I spend in the garden. And so that's kind of what I've been up to here in the month of June, is trying to correct my mistakes and recover from them, and it's a lot like March, another month of waiting. We're waiting for the seeds that I planted in the ground to sprout, we're waiting for the plants to grow and fill in, and then ultimately for fruit to start ripening. If we look over here, my blueberry plants are doing pretty well. They're getting ready to ripen. Maybe just a couple more weeks and those blueberries will be ready, and so I'm getting real excited because blueberries really are one of my favorites. They're right up there with the currants. And then if we come over here, this was my mint project. And so you can see that this mint is all filling in very nicely also. And so actually this is the chocolate mint plant that I've taken some cuttings from already, and they're doing really well. And so we'll wait for everything to fill in, and then hopefully when we come back here in July, it'll be time to do a full garden tour and see everything that I'm growing all throughout my garden. Look at all the plants that I'm growing and see what's doing really well, and maybe there will be some things that aren't doing as great as I had hoped. So make sure to like and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss when I post that July video, and we'll see you all again soon. Thank you all for joining.